Good evening and welcome everyone to this webinar on protecting our democracy from voter suppression in Minnesota and nationally. We are delighted to have you as our speaker tonight, one of the nation's top experts on voting suppression, Ms. Keisha Gaskins-Nathan, Democratic Practices Director of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. My name is Zena Pfizer. I am a proud member of the Board of Directors of Clean Elections Minnesota, the chief sponsor of tonight's program. Clean Elections is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that does not endorse or support candidates for office. We do, however, believe that voting in Minnesota should be made, nationally, should be made easy as possible and oppose efforts limited to support access to the polls. Our hope is that learning more about these issues will motivate you to take action with your legislators, inform your friends and neighbors, and be a part of protecting our democracy. Ms. Gaskins-Nathan will discuss the voter suppression efforts in the country and their disproportionate impact on communities of color. She'll also talk about Minnesota's challenges and what a culture of participation can look like as we defend voting rights for all people. A native Minnesotan, prior to her present position, Ms. Gaskins-Nathan worked as a trial attorney in private practice, executive director of the League of Women Voters Minnesota, and as senior counselor for the Brennan Center for Justice. Co-hosting our program are the League of Women Voters Minnesota, Common Cause Minnesota, Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, Minnesota Council of Foundations, Fair Vote Minnesota, Minnesota Voice, Minnesota Democracy Campaign, and Indivisible chapters of Minnesota's 3rd Congressional District, Edina, Plymouth, the St. Croix Valley, and St. Paul. Ms. Gaskins-Nathan will be interviewed tonight by Pulitzer Prize winner Minnesota journalist Dave Hage. Without further ado, here's Dave.
Hey, Zena, thank you, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. Keisha, let me start with just an introductory question. Could you tell us a little bit about your recent work on democracy for the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, what you've been working on lately?
Okay, I already messed up the mute, so we've done it once. That's good.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, and good evening. I'm so really honored to be here with Clean Elections Minnesota, all the amazing organizations that I've had the honor to work with and for around Minnesota, and so very excited to be here. So that's the first thing I wanted to say was thanks. Second thing is, as people may be aware, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund is a private foundation, and I have the honor of leading the Democratic Practice Program for the United States, as well as our Racial Justice Initiative, also focused on the United States. In our Democratic Practice Program, we focus on 3 primary strategies with the overall goal of advancing a vital and inclusive democracy in the United States. Our 3 strategies include elections and voting rights, equality of representation, which includes addressing asymmetries of power and influence arising out of money in politics, and movement building for structural change. Our team also supports the Racial Justice Initiative, which is a 3-year, $10 million program addressing systemic racism in the United States.
We've been reading about voter suppression efforts around the country in various states, pieces of legislation, other efforts to basically make it harder and harder for people to vote. As you look around the country, what would be 1 or 2 of the most troubling examples of these voter suppression efforts that you see?
I think there's 2 different kinds of voter suppression efforts that we primarily see, right? There is the blocking access to the ballot, making it very difficult, whether it's proof of citizenship, voter ID laws, that make it difficult to access the ballot. And then there's other changes that people are attempting that have to do with undermining the integrity of the vote count, right? Subsequent audit procedures. Really, I think, ill-informed demands around statewide hand vote counts that are required to bring in results within 24 hours of the close of the polls. The kind of man hours that would be required to meet those requirements is not even realistic. So the notion of saying there's both the vote suppression that is really about blocking access to the ballot, making it more difficult to vote, giving more flexibility to poll workers, requiring poll workers to step back and not interfere with poll watchers, and allowing outside pressure at the polls. There's a whole series of laws that are really about being disruptive at the ballot box itself. And I think that's something we're very used to seeing historically in this country, whether we're talking about poll taxes or other things we saw around Reconstruction and other eras. And then, like I said, we have a lot of post-election questions around audits, trying to limit how the ballots are counted. So I think those are two areas, both of which are extremely troubling, and changing how ballots and how elections are certified. Who can certify elections, taking the certification of elections out of the hands of nonpartisan election officials and throwing it into the hands of partisan legislatures, and really shifting the balance of power back to the legislature in highly partisan ways that actually undermine our elections. Right. And I think those are the things we see broadly that are, I think, some of the most disturbing.
Yeah. As our conversation goes on, I'd really like to circle back to these and talk about solutions, what we can do to prevent, to stop that kind of tactic. But first, let me ask this. There's a recent study from the Brennan Center at NYU, which found that these different voter suppression efforts, surprise, surprise, have a disproportionate impact on people of color. And in fact, are probably designed to have a disproportionate impact on voters of color. Are you surprised by that? And what are the implications of that pattern?
No, I'm not surprised.
Yeah.
My colleagues at the Brennan Center, my former colleagues at the Brennan Center, do really excellent work on evaluating these questions and being able to look at this and say, look, these are designed. It isn't happenstance. It is not simply unfortunate that there's an unfortunate impact and somehow this just happens. This is by design. And it's by design to undermine access to the polls, to gain partisan advantage. And to impact populations that are already underrepresented. So it makes it less possible for people to fight back, to use the legislative system even more. So we already have redistricting challenges. There was a recent study that came out today or yesterday from University of California that was saying, look, the redistricting measures that have been undertaken by legislatures give something like an 11-point advantage in partisan races. And oftentimes that is actually against the wills of the voters, that if the lines were drawn fairly, we'd see massively different outcomes. And the notion is sort of doubling down on these large structural inequities to specifically undermine access to the ballot, access to power, access to change by populations that people don't want to see having deep impacts on policy and policy outcomes.
Yeah. What kinds of efforts are being done around the country to stop these? Is there litigation to block some of the redistricting efforts, or to block, some of these the voter ID and ballot box efforts?
There are, I think we're seeing some slowdown in litigation with some shifts, particularly at the High Court. The political shifts of the High Court have, I think, had some impact on litigation strategies, and I think correctly so. It's a smart way to think about like what the opportunities are, what the impacts are broadly to bring individual cases, but certainly litigation is a tactic and a strategy. There are local, state-based, and national organizations that work together with an entire election protection network. And that is all about protecting voters at the ballot, at the polls, to be able to support voters as they stand in line, to be able to assist them with ballot questions, to help them go through the provisional ballot process, making sure that they're cured after the election. And so the election protection effort used to be just like on election day, you'd have like all these lawyers show up and like they'd stand outside the polls, and sometimes we'd run and get injunctive relief and come back when we saw things like students being unfairly, like students around the University of Minnesota, for example, being unfairly targeted and not being able to use their lease statements that also contained their utility information on the same notice. And we had election officials saying, no, you can't use that. We're like, yes, they can. And we had to go to a court, get injunctive relief, and stop it on election day. So you see that kind of activity continuing. But this activity is really expanded with the expansion of early voting, mail voting, post-election audit activity, and post-election cures with the increase of mail ballots. There's different rules about how those ballots are cured if there's something wrong, how voters can determine whether or not their ballot's been flagged for problems and how to fix it within the window where their ballots can still be counted. So there's a whole set of just like at the polls, right? I mean, the notion now that it used to be election day was the day to vote, and now it's really the last day to vote. And there's different ways that I think justifiably have different ways to access the polls that is more suitable, that honors different people's abilities, different people's capacities to be able to reach, to be able to cast ballots and have those ballots be counted. So we see those types of efforts. And as you identify, there's also litigation efforts. And then, of course, many of our grantees work on public education. I'm sure like Clean Elections and others work on public education efforts around legislative activity. These are C3 organizations that obviously do not engage in lobbying or electioneering activity, but do actively engage in public education to help folks understand why these laws matter, why these rules matter, why they're disproportionately impacting communities, and what that means for not just for the notion of this sort of altruistic idea that we all should be like, oh, like we should care about how everyone accesses the polls. That should be a thing we all care about. But as a practical matter, this undermines the cohesiveness of our communities. It makes it tougher for people to feel like they belong. And the attitude and orientation of ownership and belonging in community is essential for a long-term democracy. And I think that as we think about these questions, these are all the tactics that we engage in all the way across the board, from legislative to regulatory rulemaking work. And fortunately, Clean Elections, League of Women Voters, Common Cause, Indivisible, the list really is quite long, and I don't want to leave anybody out, but I'm going to, and I'm sorry. Engage in really important work around regulatory activity. What happens after the laws are passed? That stickiness around the rules. How do we make sure all of those things? And these are all ways people can involve themselves through these organizations, paying attention, reading the papers. There's tons of ways to be involved to make sure that your voice is heard and how the democracy is actually operationalized in Minnesota.
Could you mention one or two of the organizations that you think are doing good work to defend access, to promote access? You know, in case some of our listeners tonight want to say, hey, where can I find out more about these efforts? Where can I go?
In an effort not to leave too many folks out, I know that you have some amazing co-sponsors that I know are on the Facebook link that people can see and identify. I'm hoping they all have live click-through links that people can engage around, and people can see like, how do you best engage? My heart is always with the League of Women Voters, always will be, and the notion of the way the league works, the ability for folks to get in at the local level in their local chapters, to be able to engage at the city level, the state level, and even the national level is incredibly important. The league has increasingly over the years, I think, been more and more engaged with the new leadership at state and national levels. It's been an amazing organization in the process of some important evolution that has really been great, particularly around these questions of racial equity. Right. But I do think as we look at, as I said, Indivisible, as we look at I don't know. I'm afraid to name organizations and not name organizations. Yeah, right. What I would do is like really reference like the co-sponsors. I didn't see anyone on that list who I wouldn't support people engaging with, and we can talk about tactics and activities that they can think about where to get in to fit in with a lot of that great work.
Yeah. I think your work has also touched on the idea of citizen engagement, citizen participation. How do we have a healthy democracy for everybody, a multiracial, multi-class democracy? It seems like one side effect of these voter suppression efforts is that if people have trouble voting, if they feel that the electoral system doesn't work for them, is that you also suppress citizen engagement, and people feel, well, guess what? This democracy doesn't work for me. Why should I care? What can we do about that? Building around voter access, building around a healthy electoral democracy to broaden it to the broader idea of a healthy participatory democracy for everybody.
So I would argue it's not a side effect, but a direct intention. That it's not just, oh, this is happenstance, but it actually is an intention to exclude people from the political process.
Yeah.
I think the other thing we have to think about is voting is a mechanism to access and exercise power.
Mm-hmm.
If people don't feel power, they are not necessarily going to experience it through voting. The democratic process is long. It is complicated. It is a problem solving, it's a collective way to solve problems and arise solutions, right? Mm-hmm. And I mean, there are other ways to do it, right? Mm-hmm. If we had a monarchy, there'd be one person making that decision. How do we solve our problems? This is what we're going to do. That's not what we do. And the ability to be heard within this process and understand that, I think, is bigger and broader than whether or not merely someone has a hassle when they go to the polls. No question. If I have a bad experience when I go to the poll, I'm likely not to go back again. It is incredibly important that we have poll workers volunteer to be a poll worker, that there's opportunities out there that people have poll workers that see it as their job is not to protect the ballot from the voters, but to actually facilitate elections, to make sure that someone's able to make sure there's a properly cast ballot, and that properly cast ballot can be counted. And that should be the primary focus for every poll worker, and ensuring the legal integrity of the process. But I do think we also have to think about, how do our larger systems and structures work to reinforce these notions of community belonging? That it is not going to be solely created within whether or not I pull this lever and then like a week later something comes out the other side, right? I mean, arguably Minnesota, as near as I can tell, continues to be at the top of voter participation, continues to have great numbers around civic numbers. I think Tufts and the civic measures and all that. I know I'm murdering the name. I'm so sorry, Peter. But all these measures of civic health and community, Minnesota persistently ranks at the top. Minnesota also persistently ranks at the top on disparities based on race around health outcomes, rate of childhood poverty, in-school suspension rates, and food insecurity, housing insecurity. And so one thing's clear, that strict measures of democratic participation do not inherently translate into meaningful outcomes and changes in the lived experiences of people's lives. And that is so much more of how people understand our democracy works. Right. And that, to me, is a huge part of this process, which is why when we say we have a democratic practice program, it's not just the systems of votings and money and politics, which we care about them a lot, but we also think about the democratic culture. And so democratic practice is where our systems overlap with our democratic culture to actually understand how democracy is practiced. And how then are we supporting efforts to actually both recognize not just how the mechanics work, but how people are actually able to engage in those mechanics. So I do think it's more than a side effect. And that when people feel they have an ownership in community, they're going to push harder on these mechanisms and say, look, these aren't working for me.
Well, let's talk about Minnesota for a minute. This is so germane to our state. As you said, we have a reputation for doing things right in Minnesota: citizen engagement, voter turnout, et cetera. And yet we also have, I don't know if we have a reputation, but the facts are clear that we have just huge gaps between white people and communities of color in income, home ownership, educational outcomes, wealth building. What can Minnesota do to improve on this? I mean, are we in danger, or are we already at the point where African Americans in Minnesota, Latino communities in Minnesota, other people of color in Minnesota, other disadvantaged groups just say, why should I care? It doesn't do any good. This democracy doesn't work for me.
Yeah, I think what we're actually seeing is more and more folks being disenfranchised. And I think some important populations that I don't think get a lot of attention, particularly in Minnesota and other places, are Native populations. When we talk about disparities, we want to talk about who's at the top of the list. Like, it is almost always African-American and Native American populations see a lot of parity, and Native American populations in some cases see worse outcomes even. And there's huge challenges with erasure of Native populations, lack of understanding. I think Minnesota has gone a long way in sort of a culture way of like renaming places and doing some things to acknowledge and recognize the history. But whether or not there's been a parallel with that to actually understand, like, with that erasure, what were the implications for the populations that were impacted? When we erase the impact of what happened to Native Americans across this country, and in particular, places like Minnesota, Arizona, Alaska, and other places where we see high populations, but not as much impact as we'd like to see in terms of representation and quality of life outcomes, what does that mean? And so I think it's really important that we acknowledge and recognize that those types of erasures are really big and really important.
Yeah. You said something really interesting the other night related to this, which is, if I'm paraphrasing you correctly, that, in recent years, our political system has become more and more about winning and losing, and winning at all costs. And if I remember your words correctly, you said something like, democracy isn't about winning, or shouldn't be about winning. It's about, when you lose, how do you feel about the system? Did you feel that the system worked? Did you feel that the system is fair, even if you didn't get what you want? Could you elaborate on that thought?
Sure. And so I want to make sure credit where credit's due. Professor Danielle Allen, who's done an enormous amount of work and incredible work in the area of democracy and constitutional scholarship, has really talked about this notion that the stability of democracy is not determined by who wins, but by who loses. And the willingness of folks who are on the losing side of political decisions to willingly be governed by the government that they did not choose, and what that means and how we think about that. And if we think about that in terms of US democracy, we have to start thinking about the notion of, how do we start thinking about the idea that changing notions of who, air quotes, wins and loses actually isn't about a failing democracy, but shifting power. And that even within a shift of power, we all can continue to do well. I think Heather McGhee, if we've read her book, Some of Us, like, really is all about the notion of no zero-sum game. That the notion of how we think about how we benefit all, how we actually talk about the public good, and how we fund the public good, what we recognize it as being, and seeing full participation within those spaces actually is a broad benefit and is actually important to our democracy, which is a very different approach than the notion of, the only way I know a democracy is working is if I win.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, no, go ahead. Go ahead. This is great.
No, that's it. That's fine.
Yeah. You also said something else really interesting the other night, that, how to paraphrase this, and you'll have to correct me, but all of a sudden we have a certain camp in American politics, I will leave them unnamed, who kind of, for the first time in American history, feel like they're losing power, they're losing status, they no longer control our country. And instantly they're saying, elections are bogus, elections are rigged, democracy doesn't work, there's all this fraud and trickery and so on. Whereas there must be other groups in America who historically have not always gotten what they wanted from the system, or have been disappointed in the way American politics turned out, and yet kept their faith in democracy and continued to participate. Could you talk just a little bit about that?
I think that I think you named it without naming it, right? Like the notion of, look, we have populations around the country, particularly African Americans, particularly Native American populations, communities of color, that have consistently participated in our democratic process, regardless of the fact that the democratic process, our economic system, still fails these populations over and over and over again. That political decisions are made that are a huge distance but people still continue to participate. And the notion of saying, look, this is how we invest in power, this is how we build power, this is what it means to have a community. All of these things are rooted in some common experiences, certainly with messages that came out of some seminal points in our nation's history, including the civil rights, most notably the civil rights movement. And really saying, like, these are indelible messages, versus what we saw coming out of January 6th, which is a small cadre of Americans willing to inflict enormous damage, even to the point of taking human life, around the notion that they're supposed to win.
Yeah.
That the whole system is broken if I don't get what I want.
Yeah.
And that in and of itself, the unwilling, and so the tension and the balance, it doesn't take a lot to see that we're really seeing some real tensions around these questions of what it means to start shaking up these questions of like white normativity, that what it means to be like, how to show up in the United States isn't determined by one population of folks, but actually this is a collective space. And that this is for this democracy to survive as a democracy. We are going to have to really think about what it means, what are the measures, what are the mechanisms that actually support a multiracial, multi-faith, pluralistic democracy that leaves nobody behind, including white people. But the notion that it's not only for white people, that there's a whole, that everyone has a role within the democracy, can benefit from our democratic experiment, that we can continue to work and function as a society. And I would hazard a statement that we will not continue to function if we don't figure out how to get this right.
Yeah. Are you optimistic? Let me ask a two-pronged question. There's been an effort and maybe a reality to undermine confidence in our electoral system, to make people just cynical and bitter and maybe walk away from it, lose faith. Are you optimistic that we can counteract that and we can rebuild faith in our democracy, and that we can find a way or develop a way to build a new democracy that works for our changing country?
I am optimistic that this can happen. What I'm going to say, though, is I'm not optimistic about countering messages, right? One of the things we're learning, particularly about the misinformation, disinformation space, is that countering a message that's already established is very, very difficult. You know, even back when I was with the League, 2007, 2008, 2009, when we're already fighting voter ID laws, and reminding folks, we've been fighting this for a super long time in Minnesota. This stuff continues to come back. And at that time, we even knew then the notion of like, we never said the word fraud. We never wanted to say, right? Because it confuses people. It sets up a notion, sets up an idea that if we're going to say we have the democracy, we're saying like, this is about, it has integrity. Our election systems work. We know it works. And I mean, there's like really complicated affirmations for how we know people who they are, who they say they are, that they live where they say they live, that they're voting in the right place. And we make sure, and we check their mail, and we check, and lack of voter ID does not mean we don't identify voters, right? Like these are all systems that are actually confirmed and in place. And the ability to be able to speak to how our systems work, why they work, and that they work effectively, and that we're just not seeing any problems really has to be the primary message. But if we're allowing folks who are seeking to undermine our democracy to set the stage, shape the dialogue, shape the discourse, and shape the narrative, we are always going to be behind the eight ball. That it really does have to be an understanding. Part two, we also can't run around trying to put lipstick on that particular pig, right? That if it really isn't working, we have to do something about it. That we really do have to look at the systems that actually do make it unnecessarily difficult. Fortunately, Minnesota has had same-day registration since 1974. And that is something that has been shown absolutely to increase turnout, engagement at the polls. It increases community connection, all of that, right? And there's a whole set of activities that are actually like mechanisms that actually bring that to light and make it more possible. Some are voting Some of the mechanisms about how we vote. Some are things about how we fund elections. Other things are about how we access the ballot. Other things are about systemic and structural spaces. The final thing we have to remember is that democracy is never experienced by itself.
What do you mean by that? That's interesting. Yeah.
That democracy is a mechanism by which we solve problems in our society, that where we care a great deal about our economy, racial equity. And if we're not dealing with all of this stuff around economic equity, economic inequality, racial equity, gender equity, ableism, access, and the democracy and the mechanisms that we use, like, as we've already pointed out, having proper mechanisms doesn't automatically translate into better lives. And it is those better lives that help people understand and see that this is a democracy that works for them. And so it is a both and it is not merely the notion of saying, how do we do this, right? And again, that's just as much a part of our democratic culture as it is the systems and practices.
Sure. This isn't something we've talked about before, but I'm wondering about the concentration of wealth in our country and growing economic inequality. Is that a factor in our democracy challenges in your mind, that as wealth gets increasingly concentrated at the top, it's harder and harder to make sure that the system works for everybody and that the fruits of our economy and the fruits of our democracy are fairly shared?
Sure. Brandeis, he said it first, right? We can't have massive inequality and a democracy operating at the same time. It is not a thing that happens. And in the United States, we actually see that attached to racialized outcomes. What do I mean? We've got a fair number of research that tells us that if we continue on the current trajectory without any changes, the net worth of African Americans around 2049 will be close to zero.
Oh my God.
That doesn't mean there won't be any rich Black folks, but the collective net worth will be zero, the net collective wealth. Those same studies tell us that 20 years from that date, that will be the same for Latino populations. That will also go to zero.
Wow.
We also have democratic projections that tell us on a national scale, right? We're already there in some states, but on a national scale, that we'll become an air quotes majority minority country, which actually means we'll actually start looking more like the global majority, right? US will start looking more like the globe.
Yep.
If all these things are true, that means we're headed for a de facto economic apartheid in this country. There is no democracy that stands with that kind of disparity of wealth. We have to look at the trajectory of how we're thinking about our economy, how we're thinking about democracy, how these things fit together.
I feel like we have sort of a vicious cycle here that, and I'm wondering, how you break it. If economic inequality continues to grow, it subverts the outcomes for our democracy. And if citizens feel that the democracy is being subverted, they're going to participate less. And if they participate less, then political power is also concentrated along with wealth. How do we break that cycle?
Sure. And so, I mean, so there's a pessimistic view, right? You have the political scientists pointing at the economists, both going, you have to be the first mover, right? And so those are the intellectual arguments that we have all the time, and the rest of us are in the real world being like, okay, we have work to do. And to try and figure out what is that next step? How do we think about that? And part of it is, I think, reshaping how we think about and approach this work. The questions, there are political interventions that can reshape how wealth shows up, how wealth is assessed, mechanisms that deliver wealth, right? We have a capitalistic system. I will say I'm a little cynical that the US is never going to become a capitalist country, that will never be a capitalist country. But I do have a notion that says, what about collective ownership? What about cooperatives? What about changing the notion, our banking laws, our rules, to actually have an ability to spread out the notion of how people are able, because that kind of wealth, collective wealth, still conveys the same stability, right, that we want wealth for.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, some people just want, well, they have like shiny things. Like I love shiny things, right? But the idea of just like, if it's not about shiny and it's about the next generation, it's about stability, it's about homes, it's about the ability to do that. That doesn't have to be built on individual ownership. Yeah. Right now, our laws and banking systems support only that.
Yep.
But what does it look like if our communities own things differently? If our workers own the factories that manufacture, that produce the work that they work for? What does it look like if we start to reshape these opportunities? So I don't think that it's a matter of just simply saying, if we continue to do things the way we do them now, how do we change it? Mm-hmm. I'm right there with you, Dave. Like, I don't know that we change it continuing to do the things the way we've always done them. I think we really do have to think about what are the meaningful ways of reshaping our democracy and our economy that centers people, that looks at sustainability, that recognizes that a sustainable, as we think about sustainable environment, what about those notions of sustainability with our democracy? How do we talk about sustainability over time to actually build these collective problem-solving mechanisms? Are there ways people need to feel they're participating more effectively and more transparently? I think there's all kinds of things we can really think about, but I do think it's really necessary that we move in more creative and innovative ways, that we don't think in terms of how things have been done in the past. That the US is changing, who we are is changing, how we work, who we are, where we live, information, data, all this stuff is really different than when we were a small agrarian country with limited suffrage and slavery holding up the economy. There's no reason to believe that the systems that were designed to function in that sort of country would continue to work in a large, diverse country with an entirely different economic system and structure that has 330 million people that need to be accounted for. And so there's really, and logic says that probably doesn't make sense.
Yeah. We're starting to get some really good questions from our audience, and I'd like to go to those in a moment. But I just, before I let go of this topic, I'd like to ask one more on this issue of history and economic inequality. A few years ago, I was visiting my mother, my dear mother, who was a student of history, and I was writing about economics for the newspaper. And I said, Mom, this economic inequality in the US is getting worse and worse. And last year, it reached its highest point, its worst point, since 1929. And my mom just looked at me and she didn't exactly smile, but she said, yeah, we all know what happened in 1929, right? The stock market crashed. Do you think we need some sort of cataclysm, some sort of national shock before we break the racial economic power cycle that we're in now? Or can we...
You mean like a massive economic depression brought on by a global pandemic that all the major economies, something like that, Dave? Would something like that need to happen? I do think we have experienced, I think in very recent memory, a lot of things that have really pulled our economy and our democracy to the precipice, that I think people can see and recognize that a lot of our systems are kind of held together by spit and baling wire. And these are both social, social and economic safety net things, as well as our broader questions. And I think that we're there. I think when we talk about what do we need, we are screaming well past 1.5 degrees with climate change and the cataclysmic impacts. When we look at domestically and globally, 1/3 of the country of Pakistan is now underwater. 1/3. And it's just like how these things continue to impact us. We do have to think more in a global way, and we do have to think differently. And we have to, how we shape our narrative and thinking about populations, people, and engagement determines the solutions to the problems. May I give an example?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to give a quick example and then we'll turn to questions. And I think one of the things we tend to do is talk about communities as vulnerable. Like we deal with vulnerable communities.
Yeah.
And that's always sort of rubbed me a little bit wrong, right? I think when else do we talk about vulnerability, right? Like children, people with developmental disabilities, like it is incredibly infantilizing when if you go into a community and say, what do you need? People can tell you. People understand communities are intelligent collectives who can look around and see the kinds of things they need for their communities to thrive.
Yep.
But what are the solutions that you give if you say this community is vulnerable, it needs help? We're going to do all kinds of mitigated strategies to help people continue to sort of limp along in the way. Yeah. Or if we say, wait a minute, these are logical outcomes of targeting right. For over-policing, targeting for underinvestment, targeting for regressive taxes, targeting for removing teachers from schools, all of these things that I would gather that there aren't any communities, no matter what race you are, if you subject them to those kinds of conditions over a term of decades, those are the kinds of outcomes you are going to see. And if you look at solutions to systems that are to communities that are targeted, they look really different than if those communities are merely considered vulnerable.
Yeah. I'd like to come back to this. This is a great topic, but first let me take one of the questions from our audience. Someone wants to know, what can we do in our lives to help start building a multicultural democracy and a democracy where power is spread more fairly?
Sure. Some of it is some of the basic mechanism stuff that we already talked about.
Yeah.
The other questions are, and this actually people can answer better for themselves because these are really local questions.
Yeah.
How do you build for your community that sense of collective belonging? Yep. How do you communicate with people who you normally don't talk to? What does it mean to actually understand what a shared fate is? Mm-hmm. Right. I'm now bringing in one of our friends, Art Reyes, who does amazing work in Michigan for We the People. And the notion of shared fate, the notion of saying we are not in this alone.
Yep.
We aren't thinking about this just for us or our children. We're thinking about for multiple generations, and that none of us can do or be the communities we want to be on our own. And we certainly can't do it locked in these spaces of lack of communication. It means being vulnerable. Mm-hmm. It means taking risk. It means changing the notion of leadership. Mm-hmm. I was always raised that leadership was about doing and being and talking and getting out there, which is great in an interview like this. But in reality, leadership really is about listening. It's about understanding.
Yeah.
It's about listening first and trying to figure out how then does that shape my ideas? And importantly, has it changed my ideas?
Yeah.
How does it change how I understand the world? And these kinds of practices, engagement, is really, there's lots and lots of ways to do it. Mm-hmm. But I think it's incredibly important as we think about community and community intervention and engagement, that's a big part of that conversation. Yeah. And I think when we look at some of the things that our president has advocated, when I say our president, I mean RBF, not the president, through our common purpose and some of the other efforts that have moved forward, I think we've seen some amazing opportunities to do that kind of work.
Yep.
There's also practical mechanisms, right? That at the end of the day, it means speaking up. It means when you see inequity, doing something. It means not always leaving it to the folks of color in the room to name the problems.
Right.
That if we're in a shared community, we share our problems as well as our successes. And we own them together. So even in policy fights, even in these areas, when we talk about disparities, it's not Black folks in our community have a problem because there are disparities. It's because we have a problem in our community. And if we don't fix these problems collectively, and it's just as much as our problem.
Yep.
And we take ownership of that. And we actually sit down and think and work together around policy solutions with the people who are most impacted. And so I do think there isn't, I don't want to sound super Pollyanna-ish. If we all just lock arms, it's all going to be fine. These are big, hard policy fights that actually implicate people's lives. And I think, but a big, hard part of it is leaning into it and being like, how are we all standing up and how are we standing up for each other?
You said something really interesting a minute ago about that the term vulnerable communities as an infantilizing term, sort of a patronizing term, and that it works better to go to communities, ask what they need. The communities know what they want. How do we help achieve that? Can you think of examples? I mean, I asked you at the start of our conversation of examples of sort of egregious, troubling things going on around the country. Can you think of examples in cities or other places around the country where people have done things right, where they have done good neighborhood building, good economic development, good community building that
Sure.
you sort of admired?
Absolutely. I think we've seen a lot of examples. I think Minnesota is an interesting place for one, really being able to think about how does co-governance show up, right? This is it's a new-ish notion. It's not new in the grand scheme of things, but I think it's newish in the sense that it's really starting to take shape. The notion of having folks that have been active in community for years, having community leadership take on governing positions and doing it at a level of critical mass. That doesn't mean a majority, right? It means enough of it, but remaining in partnership with the community, right? I think for a long time, one of the things that happens, like one person gets elected and then all of a sudden the community shifts, and then all of a sudden they're like, you showing up for this in this way, and they become sort of a victim of community pressure, rather than saying, what does it mean to shift that notion to say, what is this co-governance strategy? How do we actually share power? How do we have, right? This is part of our democracy changes. How do we have this communication flow, a feedback loop that's not just one direction where we yell at you and then we see what vote you take, and then we yell at you some more and we see what vote you take, but actually in regular and consistent communication with community and people, with their electeds, with their advocates. And we're seeing more and more of that over time. We've seen individual elected officials do it, I think, in a really good way, but I think in local government and local governance spaces, we have seen more and more, and we've seen it in Indiana, we've seen some of it in Missouri, Ithaca, New York. We've seen it with more experimentation, places like Stockton, Birmingham, Alabama. And I think there's all kinds of examples where I think local government in particular has been able to stand up, do more experimentation. When I think about fixing the pipes, getting rid of lead pipes in Newark, when they literally finally said, okay, we're going to do this. And as opposed to like trying to do this piecemeal, did a bond issue where the money came back to the community. They made sure they hired people from the community to lay the pipe, this, that, and the other. And a project that had been taking 15 years got done in 3.
Wow.
Right. And so the notion of like, how do we start thinking about community-based solutions actually starts advancing really big solutions to really big intractable problems, when the only way we've been thinking about them is like shoveling money out the door to big corporations who then try and turn around and cream off the top. And then we have situations like Michigan, where you have people in Flint with filthy water, but Nestle pumping billions of gallons of water into bottles to be sold all over the country out of that very same state, while people are getting the water and electricity turned off because their bills are so high and it's unpotable, undrinkable water. So we know that this privatization solutions, that the way we kind of have been looking at it, is not a solution, that the shared government's solutions rooted in community, they're both democratic and economic in nature, that look at solving stacks of problems, right? Unemployment specialists, skills development, in addition to shared community problems, really start to show and demonstrate opportunities for things like that.
Yeah. Let me come back to Minnesota again. What are one or two things, that we're just not doing right in Minnesota, or one or two things you'd like to see Minnesota confront and tackle, either on an individual level that individuals can do, or as a state together? What should we be working on?
At the end of the day, if Minnesota does not take seriously this question of racial disparities, I don't know if Minnesota can actually live up to its image of itself. This isn't new.
Yeah.
I'm actually old.
Yeah.
And this has been a problem.
Yep.
Since I was in 6th grade, right?
Yeah.
Like I'm from Minnesota and lived there a very, very long time. My family is still there. I come back all the time. And the fact is, these questions of these racial disparities in Minnesota continue to grow.
I was a student journalist at the University of Minnesota. Sorry to interrupt. In 1975. And the mayor admitted in an interview, we have racist cops, we have violent cops. There's not much I can do about it.
But that's wrong, right? We know that's wrong.
That's 40 years ago, right?
Exactly.
Not new.
Exactly. And as long as we continue to see these as side effects incidental but unfortunate outcomes. These aren't unfortunate outcomes. We have to start seeing them as what they are, and that is injustice. An injustice that can be rectified. Communities aren't just sitting around unable to take care of themselves, right? These same communities are targeted and left behind by fiscal and public policy. These are decisions being made. This isn't a question of like, oh my goodness, how did this happen? There's just collections of people wandering around, unable to figure out how to do this. Yet we continue to make decisions around zoning, continues around access, to decisions around public school funding. The public school funding formulas have been crap for a really long time for both rural schools and urban schools. And this continues, excuse my language, but I'm just like, honestly, we keep pretending as if these are ancillary side effects of things that just happen to happen. It's really unfortunate, and it happens to vulnerable communities. It is not a side effect. It is a direct result of policy and fiscal decisions that are made that directly impact communities, and we can make different decisions. And until I think the elected officials and citizens of Minnesota start to see these are like changes we can make, and there's extraordinary people doing amazing work out there. And I know that many of our funding partners, including the Minneapolis Foundation, McKnight Foundation, are supporting organizations doing this work, continue to do this. And I know that our partners there probably have a much better sense of like the organizations on the ground that are engaging in many of these things across the state. But I will say that until Minnesota starts to take these questions really seriously as a direct result of decisions and not just happenstance of outcomes, I don't know that it's going to get much better.
Well, as we talk about, confronting our own state and decisions we've made over the years, to that point, we have a question from the audience. We have an election coming up. What are the questions that we should be asking candidates as we approach an election? What questions should we be challenging them with as we consider who we're going to vote for?
Sure. Super broad question. Lots of people running for lots of stuff. And so I think as we think about, as you concern yourself with a particular race or an election, rather than saying, ask them this, I would say, what are the areas of responsibility, right? Like we don't necessarily want to ask secretaries of state about reparations, right? But we do want to think about what is the Secretary of State doing about disproportionate impact about ballot access, and how are they thinking about these questions? How are we very specifically really looking at these questions of disparity? And even if you don't have the answers, they should be able to understand what is the landscape they're entering into. What are their greatest priorities? How do they think about these questions of equity? How do they relate? How do they understand that relates to the fiscal realities of where folks live? And let us not forget our local tax boards, our zoning boards, all of these boards that make incredibly important decisions that are very, very small, but incredibly important. And I think that it's both a question of how do we look at these big elections and how do we answer these other questions. And this is not easy stuff, right? We are we have really big structural problems, right? Structural defects, right, that we already discussed, hyper influence of political and economic elites, white supremacy as normative standards, right, that as these standards of normativity become less applicable, even to more and more white people, right, like these are standards that become not just like, oh, again, not happenstance, actively exclusionary, right, actively excluding people from power. And then, of course, we actually do have a disinformation, misinformation problem that is promoted online with the digital platforms and business plans and mechanisms that actually elevate these problems. And what we're seeing now is we're seeing more acceleration. We're seeing things in the Philippines, in Germany. We're seeing more and more misinformation around those elections. And let's be clear, 2024 has more head of state elections in democracies around the world than we've seen. And this includes massive democracies, India, Mexico, the United States, Ukraine, Indonesia, all of these. And if we start to see the same kind of wave of misinformation patterns that we're seeing in 2022, that we saw in 2016, there's going to have big global effects in 2024. So I'm not trying to minimize the crucible in which all this sits,
Yep.
But I do also want to elevate that the impact for people also does need to be thought about local.
To that point, I'm going to take one last question from the audience as we wind things down. Someone asks, big money can buy TV advertising, billboards, they can control a lot of the message. How do little folks like us control the message or get the message out or communicate our values and our message? Right. How do common people do it?
Some of it's networks, right? Yep. And there is diminishing returns. Like big money doesn't buy everything, right? We never had a President Jeb Bush.
Right.
That was a major money-raising juggernaut. So there is a question of diminishing returns. And I don't think we have to look at big money as the thing that can destroy everything. The idea is we have seen success with, from a campaign perspective, small donors, but I think we talk about billboards. Oftentimes we're talking about independent expenditures from people with great big checks being like, I just want to throw my ideas up on a billboard. But we also saw Mayor of St. Paul do effective work fighting against independent expenditures, really big money in independent expenditures, undermining the campaign by having effective relational community campaigns where we talked to people. But if we think we're going to outspend big money, we can't. There's never been enough money. We can't outspend them. But the fact is, that's one person buying billboards. What then, if we think about what is the relational power of people and the intervention points, that's where it's always been as effective to beat that. And that's the only thing we have to beat it, but we're not going to beat it dollar for dollar.
All right. Hey, we've reached the end of our hour. Keisha Gaskins-Nathan, I want to thank you. This has been just a terrific conversation. Thank you so much. I also want to thank the audience who joined us tonight, everybody who tuned in. Thank you, everybody, for just a great conversation, stimulating. I think we'll all go away with a lot of ideas and maybe some motivation to act. Keisha, thanks a million. It was great talking.
Thanks so much.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.